would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. I do all my reading on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. So as Dan said, I present the weekly Bookshelf program on Radio National. And the brief of that program is to focus on fiction, which means I regularly miss out on new memoir and narrative non-fiction, which are such dynamic forms. So I have to say I'm absolutely delighted both to have read this book and to be here with Heather Rose, a writer who knows her way around beauty, creativity, grief, art and landscape, and fantastic shoes. I hope you've taken notice here. Among other things, Heather Rose, hello.
Hello, Kate. It's such a privilege to be here with you. Thank you. And it's so lovely to be here with all of you. I haven't been over this side of Sydney before, so thank you, Dan, for the invitation, and to Roaring Stories for the opportunity to meet you all. Thank you.
Heather, you begin this book with an image of a girl looking up and out into the world and sort of asking questions of it. So who was that girl?
I grew up in south of Hobart. It used to take an hour by bus to get to our house. It's down the river. And my father was a devout Christian, and my mother is someone who believed that heaven was here on earth. And that kind of interesting division between my parents' life philosophy, I think, was the bedrock of me becoming quite curious about this sort of the unseen, what was not seen. And I was standing, I have no idea what prompted me to do this, but I was standing in the school ground at my primary school, which only had 60 students. It was a very small place, and I walked up to the beautiful gum tree that still exists in that playground. I went to visit it just a few weeks ago, actually, and I looked up and I was talking to whatever my father was talking to in church, or some sense of something more powerful than I was, vastly more powerful. And I really wanted to acknowledge that I was here I am alive, and I'm ready to be of service. And I don't know why it's such a strange thing, but it was a powerful experience. And I didn't, of course no one answered back, but there was definitely a sense that I had made it clear that I was here to be of service. And I don't know, what ensued from that really. But I have to wonder, because writing this book, whether it all ensued from that, really.
And that memory is of you at about the age of 6. But of all the ways of imagining your way out into the universe, I'm interested that you pegged it to the idea of curiosity. So what does curiosity mean to you?
Well, I had to think about that a lot writing the memoir. What does curiosity mean? And I thought it's at the bedrock of all creativity, I think. Both passion and curiosity seem to me to be the fundamental characteristics of living a creative life. You have to be curious, you have to wonder, and that creative life might be because you want to be an astrophysicist or a mathematician or a painter or a dramaturg. So it seems to be fundamental to wanting to know more about the world, being willing to do the research, being willing to seek out people and look into the human condition, or look into nature, or look into the oceans, and then be passionate enough to have the determination to learn more about that and to become someone who is willing to follow a path, which all creative lives have to do, and it's a great lesson in determination. So I think that curiosity was also born of a number of experiences that I convey in the memoir that lived beyond the normal human experience. My experiences with the unseen started very early, and I couldn't deny those. Once they started to happen, I thought, oh, there really is more going on, and I wonder what is going on. So yes, that curiosity, it's still with me. I'm still curious.
And that memory, that playground, that was in Tasmania, where you still live, how much has that place, Tasmania, and I guess islands in general, how much has that shaped you?
Well, when I left Tasmania when I was 19, I decided I'd go to all the islands I could find. So that's one of the reasons I went through Asia and up through Thailand to the islands in Thailand, and then on to Europe. I went to lots of islands too. I think island cultures are quite fascinating because they're a little microcosm of life and often attract curious characters. And as a writer, I'm fascinated by character. So I think there's also a sense of being held, but also surrounded by something that's, can be very dangerous. So there is a feeling of both being enclosed and living within a very small world, but also having to face the realities of living in a place that's dominated by weather and the vagaries of the ocean, which became powerful in my life in many different ways.
But I'm sure you've noticed, Heather, I've started by asking you about looking out into the world and then by asking about landscape. And that's partly because that is easier than asking you to talk about other people. But in a memoir, you're not just talking about yourself. You're talking about family, people close to you, people you've interacted with. So when you write a memoir, what are the challenges of having to write about other people?
It's the hardest thing of all, by far the hardest thing of all, because we all have a different understanding of history. I'm sure you've all got siblings that or family members who have a vastly different perspective than you do on some things. Maybe it's a subtle perspective, but it nevertheless is intrinsic to their worldview and yours is intrinsic to your worldview. So I knew there would be dispute. I thought a lot about who I would include and who I didn't include, and my beloved publishing team are here tonight, and I completely owe this book to both Ali Laveau, Gabby Nair and Jane Paul Freeman, who are all here tonight. Ali has been my editor over 5 novels, I think now, and possibly even more, and it was initially a very large manuscript, cumbersome and unwieldy, and I knew it was too big, and their fine advice got me to cut it back to this much more pared back version that really houses those experiences that enlivened me and awakened me and enriched me, and also were deeply formative, I think, and they have gone on right to this day. That there are very recent experiences that have been formative, because I consider that I'm always evolving, hopefully forever. So the difficulty of the initial draft had a lot of stories about people I travelled with, travel stories, more family stories, yes, anecdotes, and really they were around the outside of this central story that I've ended up telling as a way of kind of diverting you all from what was really going on. So once I cleaned that out, I got left with a very spare crew of characters, so there's a lot of people in between the sentences, and there are many people who will read it who know me and have had shared parts of my life with me that aren't in the actual memoir, but they will know the stories that they have around the outside of those particular scenes and moments in my life. It was extremely hard to write about my parents. They're both still alive. They're in their late 80s, and my dad is a really private person, and I was terribly worried about sharing it with him. I thought he'd find it really hard, especially because I share some intimate moments with him, including one when we thought he was dying a few years ago. I didn't know what my mum would make of it. She's not a great reader, so I wasn't even sure she'd actually read it, or at least only the bits about herself. So it was, which has proved to be true. I think I've dedicated it to her. I mean, first of all, because she's my mum and I wouldn't be here without her, but also because there's such an arc in the story for me about her. I thought that she might understand that, but that's not been the case so far. So, you know, it's... My children were very gracious. My middle son is here tonight, Byron, who lives in Sydney, and they all read it and loved it and wanted me to keep it just as it was. And I wrote it for them when I was 50. I was really unwell, and I thought I better put these stories down for them, because if I'm not here, I want them to have them for their own children and then maybe their grandchildren to know who I was. I also requested of some people it to be included, and some people I've changed their names because they didn't ask to be included and I didn't ask them, so I've changed some details and changed names. Yeah, it's precarious, Kate. That's all there is to it.
And some people are quite ruthless in the way that they approach memoir and in the way that they decide to approach telling other stories. And they often have quite a profound creative reasoning for that. But it sounds like you're thinking about it a lot, the ethics of it.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm quite a private person too, and it's strange for me that I've written something so bearing. But yeah, the creative process demands more than we think it will, and this was one of those examples.
Well, particularly because this is a novel that, you know, it's about family and place and spirituality, which we'll get to, but it's also profoundly about grief. How comfortable are you in telling us what's at the heart? I mean, what can you say? Because it's different writing a story, and we'll all read it, to sitting in front of people. I mean, what do you feel like you can tell us?
Oh, yeah, it doesn't ever get easier, this bit. So I'm the third of 4 children, and I had 2 older brothers and a younger sister. There were 4 of us born within 6 years, so we were very close. And I was very close with my oldest brother, and we all spent a lot of time with both sets of our grandparents who lived very close. So we were, you know, my grandparents on my mama's side, on my dad's side, lived at the bottom of the school oval. So we went there for lunch nearly every day through primary school. And my grandparents on my mum's side lived in the same suburb as us, and then they moved over the hill to a place by the water. And I feel like I grew up with a fishing line in my hand, sitting in a dinghy with my grandfather fishing. We were out at sunrise, we were out at sunset. He was the marvellous influence in my life who would look at the horizon with the sun coming up and he'd say, "Look at that, Heather, that's what beauty is." He was a marvellous human being who had fun at every opportunity. He had the clock set at 10 to 11 at the family shack where we spent an enormous amount of time. And it was set at 10 to 11 because he said it was always time for a little something. So he was a marvellous man, and at the shack we ran wild. We just ran wild. I didn't wear shoes for 3 months of the year, and all the school holidays, winter and summer, we were there. And there were oysters down on the shore there. We had the shack that wasn't on the beach. We had the shack on the mud flats. And there were oysters down there. So I'd just take the hammer and chisel from the shed right from a really early age and just down there and clunk open the oysters at low tide, sit there and putting oysters in my mouth. And so Grandad was an enormous influence. He taught me all sorts of bushcraft and hunting skills. And when I was 12, he was also very close to my brother Byron, and this particular, the September holidays came around and Byron went off a few days early with my grandparents to the shack. We were following in a couple of days, and he and my granddad went out fishing one day, and they were pulling in a net and the wind came up and there was a squall and they both fell out of the boat and they didn't come home.
It's so profound. But Heather Rose, you're a storyteller, you're a shaper of ideas, but in reaction to this tragedy, your family used silence. Mm-hmm. So how do you understand the shape of that silence? You say they didn't talk about your brother.
No, we weren't allowed to talk about him. It was too painful for my mum. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to us. Dad wanted us to go and all get counselling, but Mum refused. And so we just went on with this enormous silence at the heart of our family, and of course it destroyed us all. And, you know, within a few years my parents had separated. My mother had fallen in love with someone else, and my remaining brother, you know, had a time that he was away, and then he ended up on the west coast of Tasmania. My mother remarried and took my dad. She asked my dad to move out, and then she embarked on this relationship, and she took my sister with her to another part of Hobart, and so I got left in the family house on my own in year 12. And was there for some time until she sold the house, and then I was on my own. So, yeah.
So how much is this book trying to make sense of that whole moment and all the waves and ripples that come out from it?
I know it seems strange to say this, but I didn't really understand that until my sister read the memoir. And she said, "Oh, I finally understand all the threads in my life. I see that all of them have come from that incident." And I think we all knew that at one level, but it's given us a different sense of how profound grief is, and grief and loss. And I'm sure there are some of you here who know this story very well, but having that experience at such a formative age, I had, as you know, already been a curious person, but it sent me into sort of a search for what was life and what was death in a way that perhaps I wouldn't have done otherwise. And for my siblings, it was the same. I mean, we've all been terribly damaged by it, and one of the most beautiful things that's happened since I wrote the memoir is, you know, I was very worried about my dad. So I went over to see him one evening, and I was in tears, and I said, "Dad, I'm really worried about you reading the memoir." And he said, "There's nothing you could ever write that would make me stop loving you. It's going to be okay." And then when he read it, he actually said, "We all needed you to write this memoir." And he has been awakened in a way. He's been proud of himself in a way that I had not anticipated for him. And my sister's really got strong. She did the launch down in Hobart. She stood up and emceed, and she was strong and beautiful, and it's had a powerful effect. And
so you've given space for a narrative.
Yes, I think that's right. But I didn't realise that's what I was doing. And I would have done it for that if I'd known, but it was so hard to get through it. It was the hardest thing I've ever tried to write.
Well, and as you say, with your publishers, you had to chisel it out because what you were writing around it, was it sitting there as a silence for you as well?
I think I was trying to hide. I know that seems ridiculous to write a memoir and try to hide inside it, but possibly I've tried to hide for a very long time. And those spiritual aspects that I then embarked on a number of spiritual adventures, and I hadn't ever wanted those to be public, because I think Jane and Gabby, who know me very well, thought this was quite funny that I didn't want to be seen as a spiritual person, and because anyone who knows me knows that I am that, but I didn't want to be seen as that, because I think I had it sort of collapsed with, you know, first of all being something of a nutcase, but also I felt people would want me to know things and be wise in some way, and I'm completely unevolved and I don't know about anything. So it's just it seemed to me a really poisoned chalice to be seen in the world as having some sort of answers about I don't know what, but I don't have them, just so you know I don't. I have lots of questions.
Well, it's because it's all about words. Perhaps we can give you, rather than a capital S spiritualism, we'll give you a lowercase. That will make you feel better.
Much better, thank you.
And because you write, grief is a pilgrimage, a long song, a poem that's not quite finished. which is a way, I guess, to move on to the idea of journeys. So you travelled outwards. So what were you looking for? Was it some sort of resolution of this pain and grief?
I didn't know that. My first endeavour in this regard was that after year 12, because I was on my own, I worked day and night actually. I had a full-time job and then I worked nights in a bar and saved up to go overseas. So I went overseas when I was 19, and I had been given the name of a Buddhist monk in Bangkok, and once I'd made my way through Asia overland for a number of months, I arrived in Bangkok and went to meet him and studied with him for a few weeks, and then he said, I think you'd really appreciate going out to the border of Laos to a monastery out there. And it was set up by a man called Ajahn Chah, who was the head monk of Thailand at the time, for Westerners to go and study Buddhism. So I went out there to the border of Laos, and it was during a period of time called the Rains Retreat, which is when the Buddhist monks go home to their villages, and they are in silence in the villages, in the monasteries that are close to their home villages. And it's a period of retreat where the rules are little talking, little eating and little sleeping. So we'd start meditating at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'd go through till about 11 o'clock at night. We ate one meal about 9 o'clock in the morning, and we did walking or chanting or sitting in silence meditation for all the rest of the day, other than a couple of hours in the afternoon. And I did that for several months, and we were in silence the whole time. And it was really an incredible experience. Of course, as a 19-year-old, I imagine it was formative in ways I can only sort of imagine, really, because I don't have a test Heather who didn't do all these things, but I know that it certainly expanded my sense of reality, and it gave me a great love for silence and for meditation, which I still do. It also opened the window to a sense that we're much more than just human beings, and I have never forgotten that. There were profound experiences there from that kind of deprivation and that amount of concentration that helped to hone my brain and also opened me up to different senses, I think.
The shallower among us, including, I don't know, me, got slightly distracted in that story by the spiders.
Oh yes.
Sorry. Couldn't cope at all.
Yes.
I mean, I wasn't sure whether it was the silence and the meditation I couldn't cope with more, or the giant spiders. But, you know, I wasn't coping with either of them, to be honest.
I have to say that that's one of the greater moments of overcoming fear in my life, that I was given this small room. You know, we're all in very simple accommodation, and as Kate said, I walked into the room. You know, it's 11:30 at night. I'd been awake on the train the night before because it was a 12-hour train trip out there, and I'd been thrown into monastery life the minute I'd arrived in the morning. Suddenly it was 11 o'clock at night. I was terribly tired, and I'd laid out my sleeping sheet because it's hot. You know, it's Thailand, and I looked, and there were only screens on the windows. There's no glass, and I looked and saw this, as I call it, a mandala of huntsman spiders. And there's only one animal in the world that concerns me, and that is the huntsman spider at this point. And because we had so many at the shack, they were truly terrified me. In fact, I'd had to go and have hypnotherapy in my teenage years so that I would keep breathing if I saw one. So it had been a thing I'd had to try and manage. I saw them and I thought, oh no. And then I realised they were on the outside of the wire, and I thought, oh, thank goodness. I got into my sleeping sheet, and it was just a candle, just by candlelight, and I laid down, I looked up at the ceiling, and there were another 23 or 24 on the ceiling right above the bed. And what do you do? What do you do? I'm in a Buddhist monastery, you're not allowed to kill anything. There were too many of them anyway, nothing I could have done about them. They'd have all just run everywhere. So I just did what a good traveller does in Asia. I ignored it and I pulled the sleeping sheet over my head, and 3 hours later I got woken up by the bell.
Well, this is a portrait of a broadcaster trying not to go la 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 out loud through that entire story. So, okay, we'll just have to move on from that, but I did have to ask. But that whole question of silence and learning silence and the silences that you've written around, I mean, the more I think about it, the more important that is to this book, or to my reading of it. And I was also really struck in your travel section by one section that just made me go, oh goodness, she is telling me this story. In one section as you're travelling, you say, heroin takes all the noise away, all the pictures. It takes away judgment, pain, blame and shame. I can obliterate all feeling. And I thought, woomph, you're just putting it there on the page. How hard was it to lay yourself bare to us as you have?
It was really hard. There were so many things I hesitated to share, and thought about my children, thought about my friends, thought about the impact on the readers. And then I did pretty much my rule for life, and I just got brave. And I thought, you know, one of the things about writing this was to help the readers who've followed me through many books of all different sorts to get a sense of who was at the heart of that book. And I thought, I can't attempt to show them who's at the heart of this book unless I get to the heart of myself and share what's really at the heart of me and what's been at the heart of my life. So I just got brave, but it was incredibly hard, and I fell apart so many times when writing this book, and especially in the last year and a half through the final finishing of it, the cutting back that I did, and the having to own my journey in the way that it's told now, which is actually the essence of everything that's been important to me in my life. It was really hard, and I wouldn't want to have to do it again. And yet, beyond it, it was certainly, a healing process in many ways that I hadn't expected. And at the end of it, I also feel braver. And I know that seems funny given everything that's in the book, but there's a liberation in saying what's so and really sharing vulnerably. And I know Brené Brown talks about vulnerability being one of the most courageous things that we can do. And I think that's true. I think vulnerability is enormously difficult, and probably we do anything to steer away from it, including medicating ourselves and all of that. But it's really, it has its rewards. There's an expression in landmark education, for those of you who know anything about that. And I always think of it as kindergarten for human communication. But it says the definition of courage is to say it like it is and take what you get. And that has guided me for a long time. So this time I did it, writing about myself.
Well, and you say that you're not going to do it again, but on the other hand, this is feeding into all of your writing. And I'm just struck by the precision with which you're writing. And I keep on thinking as you're talking about, and I wish I could quote it properly, I was rereading Hilary Mantel's Giving Up the Ghost recently, and she talks about looking almost ruthlessly at your own childhood and memories, and then she says cutting every page by a third. And that sort of combination, that sounds like what you're doing. But the other, and look, I'll confess, I'm sort of skirting around the philosophical side of your spiritual journey because I'm just not equipped to ask you the right questions. And when we turn to you guys, you probably ask much more acute questions there because I just never quite know what to do with that side of the story. So I'll just admit that as my own deficiencies. But with your spiritual story, your emotional story, they're so embodied. Not just in place, but in your own physicality. And so as a story about grief and pain, it's also a story about physical pain. So tell us about, I guess, because you've had to write about chronic illness and debilitating pain and dealing with that. And I'm almost wondering how you keep writing and have had a career as a writer in dealing with that. So I wonder if you could talk about what that type of pain does to you. Just the easy questions. That's the spiritual ones are too hard. I can't do those. But I'm quite happy to put you on the spot emotionally and physically. So there you go.
All right. Well, as you'll discover in the book, I leave this very late in the story because I really didn't want to talk about this more than anything. When I was, in my childhood, I started to have pain in my joints. I was a very physical child. I was very athletic, and I loved running and hockey and tennis. And by the time I was 17, I was windsurfing. I had spent years by then kayaking 5 kilometres a day. But my body started to really hurt, and I went to endless physios, and all sorts of people had opinions. But when I was 21, I was diagnosed with a condition called ankylosing spondylitis. It's hereditary, but I was the first person in the family to be diagnosed with it. We can look back now and see that people ought to have been diagnosed, and it is there's a family of diseases that come with that are pretty nasty too. So I get other symptoms as well, but it means that from time to time through my teens and my 20s and on into, a few weeks ago, I get completely felled by severe pain, and it can happen at any moment, and it could just be from bending over to, rinse my mouth out when I've been cleaning my teeth, or as it has on occasion. It's haphazard. I have done endless therapies and remedies and seen countless practitioners.
You're not allowed to give advice. Like, seriously, don't
Please
pick
don't.
up, don't stand up and give advice. Sorry, just to interrupt.
Yes, thank you. And it's been a huge part of my life. There's been weeks and months where I've been unable to walk and have had to live on very serious drugs, and just the joy of walking every day is never ever taken for granted by me, and it's taught me a lot of empathy. There are a lot of people who are way worse off than I am, and I know I look really healthy to a lot of people, but as I mentioned in the book, my children have a nickname for me, which is Meryl, because I could win an Oscar for looking great when I don't feel that.
Look, I feel bad for having, made you spell that out.
Sure.
But in fact, the other thing about reading this book is that, it is about grief and pain, but it's not just about that. There is an extraordinary capacity for joy and creativity. So, are they separate things or are they entwined?
Yes, I didn't answer that other part of your question about how it is to be a creative person with all of that. I think all of us who've got physical or mental challenges, and let me say that having a chronic illness physically is no different to having one mentally. That's what I know of my friends who I share that territory with. I suspect that there's a certain openness to life, and life in all its various iterations, the seen, the unseen. I start the book, mentioning that physicists now, as we know, think that 70% of what is here is dark energy, 25% is dark matter. So the 5% that we think of as human life, and all the things we've invented, all the ideas we've had, all the books we've written, all the creations we've made, is only 5% of what is actually here. We just don't have the senses to know, and it might be 0.005%. They may yet find out we're in a tiny, tiny microverse, actually, the human condition. And so there is a lot that goes on that is unseen or sensed but not discussed, and that's one of the things I really hope the book does, is I hope we start discussing the unseen and the things we feel and the things we sense much more, because one of the delights of going through life being curious is that I've asked a lot of people, did you ever have an experience you couldn't explain? Did something happen where you felt, you know, a presence, or have you ever been visited by someone from the past or someone who had died? And over the years, most everyone has a story of something, some sense that, oh, that was outside the normal experience for me or for any human. And, you know, there's countless stories, we know that. But living a creative life is a little bit like that for me. I get visited by characters. So, and they'll show up in my mind, and like for Bruny, I was walking the beach at home and I looked down the Derwent River and I saw a cloud bank, and it looked like there was a bridge between the mainland of Tasmania and Bruny Island. And I thought, oh, why would there be a bridge? And then almost instantly Astrid, the main character, turned up and I could see her at Hobart Airport. And then I followed them home and life went on. There were the Colemans. So that's how it is for me in my mind. So I have access to other worlds all the time through my imagination. And in fact, living through the thousands of hours it takes to write a novel, those people get very real, and it really fills in as time goes on until I know everything about their worlds and what their furniture's like and what colour the carpet is and all of those sorts of things. One of the joys, I know this sounds crazy, but one of the joys of being relegated to dealing only with pain, because once the pain gets severe, there is nothing but breathing, the mind does take flight. There is no question about that. It's too hard to stay in the body. So the Butterfly Man comes from that experience. It came from when I was in a world of white pain, totally medicated on, 4-hour morphine and all of that. And then I had to do something with my mind, and so it took flight and created the Butterfly Man. And once I got well, some months later, I started writing it down. The other part of living with pain for me has been the exploration I've had in how do I manage myself emotionally. Because for those of you who also live with chronic pain, and I'm sure there's some in this room, it's an easy place to get depressed. It's super easy to go down a rabbit hole of feeling, like an oxygen thief. Like, I'm useless to my family, I'm useless to my children, what sort of role model am I? So I had to look at what else I could do with those thoughts, because that's a really dark place to live, and it's a dark place to live when you're having flares pretty constantly, or when you're stuck for 3 or 4 months on walking sticks and you can't drive the car and you can't pick up your toddler. So I started to explore different sorts of meditation, and I looked at meditations that elevated my emotions. So what are ways that I can elevate my emotions so that I don't go into those dark places? How do I pull myself back out? And that's when I started to realise that there was a paradoxical relationship between joy and pain. The more I felt joy, the less I could feel the pain. And the more I allowed myself to suffer, or think of myself as suffering, the more the pain took hold, the more I felt joyful and grateful. And I would literally lie in bed and look at clouds and be just so grateful that clouds are constantly changing. They're always moving and reforming, and that in itself is a highly creative process. And being grateful for clouds, and being grateful for the smallest thing, like the warm cup of tea my child has just brought me, or life is so rich for all of us here in the West. There are so many things to be grateful for, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I wouldn't give it back for everything it's taught me about appreciating life, and the generosity that it's brought to my life has been extraordinary.
Well, and that sense of joy, creativity and harnessing the imagination absolutely shines through in this book. It hasn't been out in the world for very long, but the other thing we know about books is that they're also prisms through which people see their own or other experiences. So just before we turn to questions from the floor here, what have people been saying to you?
They've been beautiful. They've been so beautiful. One of my favourites was just a couple of days ago when I was in Hobart and I was swimming outside my house. I do that all the time. I was swimming along and a dear friend of mine was swimming past and I didn't have my glasses on so I didn't recognise her, but she calls out and she swims over. She goes, Heather, I finished the book last night. I said, and she said, it's fantastic. I'm just going to get braver. And I looked at her and I've known her all my life. She's a formidable woman. She sea kayaks between Tasmania and King Island. She climbs mountains. We're the same age. She's off on some crazy bushwork with her children and she's formidable. And I said, Janie, you're one of the bravest women I know. You're formidable. And she said, oh no, I mean emotional bravery. And that was like, that's wonderful. How beautiful. I mean, I don't know what else will happen, but that alone and the way it's caused my family to free themselves, I think, a little bit from this story. Even my mum, I think, is coming to that.
Goodness me, what a conversation. And I'm sure you have questions as well. Now, bear in mind, I will be repeating them. So that the people watching online, so don't be shy. This is a great opportunity for you to ask a question of Heather Rose. So who would like to start?
And tell me your name before you have a question, please.
You can start with that half thought through question where halfway through saying it will make sense and I will attempt to distill it in the third row here.
I'm Victoria. I just wondered
Hi,
if your
Victoria.
family can now talk about your brother and your grandfather openly?
I'll just repeat that for the
yes.
people online. So the question was whether after this book your family can now talk about your brother and your grandfather more openly.
Well, I heard my mum talk about my grandfather for the first time since it all happened, and she told us stories at the dining table a couple of weeks ago, and she went on for about 20 minutes about him and told us beautiful stories that I'd never heard. So, yes, so I think there will be more and more of that.
More stories coming out.
Yes. And Jane?
Jane.
Hi. You taught me a very special lesson, many special lessons, but particularly in this book, I would like you to share with everyone what you learned about spiders. It really inspired me to make friends with a spider. But you intuited something about the spider that really meant something to me.
And again, I'm just going to repeat that, sorry. So, and this is the publisher, Jane Polferman, saying that she learned a very special lesson about, well, both about spiders and something that you understood about them that has helped her make friends with a spider in the back room.
So in the monastery, we would help the village people get breakfast sorted, and I was in we wore long black robes as novices, and I pulled a big silver bowl out from a bench, and a huntsman fell out of the bowl and ran up my leg under the dress. And I had been in silence and meditation for, many weeks by this point, and I felt it. And in the strange world of being in silence, and that kind of process slows the mind amazingly. So all senses become attuned in a different way. And so I just I was standing very still, and I didn't at all panic. Just something in that meditative space just made me be very still. And I felt this spider run all the way up, get to my knickers, and hover right there, right there on my pubic bone. And I was like, and I could feel it quivering. I could feel it actually quivering. And then it ran down the other leg and ran away. And I thought, not only am I way bigger than it, which has not been the case in my mind until then, actually. Not only was I way bigger than it, but it was terrified. It was truly terrified of me. And all it wanted was what we all want. We want to be alive. It wanted to live. And it had run up on this giant. And the fear that it had in it was so much worse than any fear that I would have. So I've always been very kind to them since then. And they're very important. We've lost so many insects. I've just been in America earlier this year for 4 months, and through the 6 or 8 weeks I spent on the west coast of America in California and then into the Midwest, I hardly saw an insect. Because of industrial farming, I think, they have just irradiated them. It's going to be a major problem, so please be kind to insects.
And there is an activist edge to the book as well. But Gabby.
Okay, so Kate, you said you didn't want to tackle the philosophical, but I will. Part of Heather's memoir concerns the 3 summers, or the 3 northern hemisphere summers, four, which she went and practiced Sundance in different deserts in the US. And I've asked her this question many times, and you've never adequately answered it. Why did you do it?
And I'll just repeat that. So the question is about 4 summers that you spent doing a Sundance in the desert. And so the big question is, why did you do it?
I was called. I know Gabby doesn't like that answer, but I was called. I was introduced to Native American ceremony when I was living in Melbourne, and my first experience in a sweat lodge gave me a completely metaphysical experience that I couldn't deny, and after that I had repetitive dreams night after night after night, and when I went to speak to someone who understood those things, they said, oh, you're being called to Sundance. And it meant I had to go to America through the summer for 4 years, and it was a 4-year commitment, every day of 4-year commitment that also included me going to America and dancing in that ceremony and other ceremonies that I had to participate in order to be eligible for that ceremony, but then dancing every year for 4 years in what is for the Lakota there are 7 sacred ceremonies for the Lakota, and the Sundance is the one that is for life. It involves the whole tribe, and it's the ceremony for the health of the tribe, the health of the world. And I participated with them doing that for 4 years during my 20s. So.
What's the after effect of that? Do you have an ongoing relationship with those people or those communities?
Yeah, I do. I'm very close still to some of my Sundance brothers, and I don't have any Sundance sisters. The women I danced with were Native American, and I lost track of them because we didn't have social media back then. The thing that never leaves me is my connection with nature. It's always with me. Always, yeah. Every day.
And here's another question coming up.
Hi, I'm Donna.
Hello,
I'm
Donna.
really interested in just hearing all this. What pain relief were you on for the river one?
And the question is about what pain relief you were on for the river wife. For the river wife. So I sense a hallucinatory question here.
So The River Wife, for those of you who haven't read it, is a book that is set in the highlands of Tasmania, and it is about a woman who's a woman by day and a fish by night. And the world that I was living in when I wrote that, Donna, was I had my 3rd baby, and she was born with an asthmatic condition, a wet asthmatic condition, So in order for her to be able to breathe, I had to hold her upright to sleep. And so I stayed awake for weeks and weeks and weeks, and that's how the river wife came to me.
Yeah.
Weirdly, I didn't think it was written on ghosts.
It was written on baby joy.
But baby joy and sleeplessness.
And sleeplessness, yes,
indeed. Now, this is an opportunity for one final question, and there's one coming up here.
I'm Gabriel. If your brother and your grandfather were here today, what would be the first thing you'd tell them?
And so the question is, if your brother and grandfather were here, what would you want to tell them?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the enormous gift of both your life and your death, because it's made me who I am, and I would never have wanted that to happen to them, but I also feel, and this is why the book is called Nothing Bad Ever Happens Here, we can't go back, we can't change the past. There's an element of surrender in that, if we really get down to it. It's about surrendering to what's so, and if I surrendered to what's so, they gave me an enormous gift.
Thank you. Thank you. Heather Rose. And I should say too that Nothing Bad Ever Happens Here is published by Alan and Unwin, and I think you're about to be led to where you might like to buy.
Can I please ask you all to give another round of applause?